Welcome back to the channel folks, and to another painting tutorial, the subject of which is really quite tricky, and that is going to be splinter camo on Zelt bands. The challenge when recreating any kind of camo is first of all your choice of colours, and secondly the shapes. Now your choice of colours, you do have a bit of leeway. You know, how does it look on the tabletop, for instance? If you choose colours that just kind of meld into each other, they don't look so good on the tabletop, so you have to use a little bit of artistic license to get the contrast between the colours that you need. But the shapes, however, that is a little bit more important, in that if the shapes don't match the historical references, regardless of the colours you choose, it's not going to look like the camo you're after. The size of the camo blotches is also important as well, to give you a proper balanced look, balance between all the colour elements too. I am going to attempt to get the blotches as close as possible to a scale size for this example, though there's plenty of really good examples out there where they use larger camo blotches and it looks just as nice. Because I am painting such small blotches, you're not going to see me adding any rain marks to the finished look. Rain marks can look quite nice, but typically on close-up pictures. If you've got really small camo blotches, then lots of rain marks all over a figure, because there are lots of rain marks on splinter camo folks. It's not just one or two lines here and there, they're all over the surface, then you just get a bit of a mess. So there's not going to be any rain marks, but I think you'll agree that it's still got a nice solid splinter camo look to the finished result. So to begin with, what I've done is I've given an overall coat, this is a shade coat, and an undercoat of German Camo Black Brown. I'm going to layer up from that point. If you're familiar with my other painting, you know that I layer up from a shade colour. And I'm starting with the base colour for the Zelt band, and for this I'm using German Camo Beige World War II. Now I'm just putting a layer all over the Zelt band. Normally I'd be leaving little bits of shade to help create shape. You can't do that, not easily, with a camo. I'm going to have to cut the shade in later on the Zelt band part of the figure, but you'll see me leaving the shade in when I'm going to the field grey elements of the mini. Now it's going to take two coats to get this covered properly. We want a nice solid opaque layer. We're not going to try and do that in one pass, because it's just going to look horrible and lumpy, and bear in mind we have a dark shade undercoat and a light colour going on top, so be patient and get it down in two passes. Once that solid coat is down, I'm going to do a little subtle highlight. It's not going to be anything extreme, it's not going to be anything that might even be very noticeable in the finished result. If it is going to be very noticeable, this very busy panorama of camouflage colours is going to just get completely out of control and become a total blur. So I'm going to use some medium grey and put some highlighted areas on it, following the sculpt of the figure. And now we're on to those camo blotches, starting with Panzerace's brown camo blotches. Now get yourself some reference pictures so you've got an idea of what it is you're trying to replicate. Bear in mind that it's going to be easier or harder to do that on different areas of the figure. For instance, these large panels, good place to start because they've got lots of space for you to work on. But the smaller panels, you know, the folded areas around the sleeves, the front panel, below the waist and so on, a bit more tricky. Start on the larger areas and build up your technique from there. So I tend to start with a sharp wiggly line, almost like a lightning bolt, so to speak, and then I build up some of that line into the angular blotches that you see on splinter camo. Remember that you can always fine tune this at any point by going back to your base colour, and I did that at various points during the painting of this figure just to get the right balance. And by balance I don't just mean the shape, I also mean how much of the subsequent camo blotches, the green ones, and how much of the base colour is visible in the finished result. You can't have one dominating over the other. If you look at your references again, you'll see it, you know, it's a little bit of a balance across all the colours, and that will allow you to get the strongest contrast between all of the colours too. And it's worth noting when creating your camo patterns, whilst it's not going to be super visible at this scale, if it's something you want to pay attention to, when you've got different areas of fabric, whether they are sewn together or whether they're just lying one on top of the other, don't carry the camo pattern on unbroken over all those surfaces, because they represent different prints of the original fabric, if that makes sense. And then when that's all done, I'm going to go into Panzerace's green splinter blotches. I think they might be called Splinter Blotches 1 and Splinter Blotches 2, but you'll be able to tell by the colour quite easily. And I'm going to just repeat the process, once again bearing in mind the balance between all three colours. It is good to have an overall appearance of a beige colour uniform with camo, rather than, for instance, a green or a brown camo with a hint of beige. And once this second camo colour is down, I'll be able to have a look at the finished result and see if I need to tidy things up a little bit. There may be some lines that are maybe a bit too rounded and they need to be sharpened. There may be a little bit too much of one colour in a certain area and you maybe need to add a little bit of that camo beige back in. But a quick look around the figure will give you a nice balanced finished result. Now I applied a little bit of highlight to the brown and the greens following the folds of the figure. It doesn't stand out too much, so I don't recommend it if you're going to be painting it at this scale. If you're going to be painting larger camo blotches, yeah, fair enough, that probably will stand out. But here it didn't make much of a difference. Didn't take a lot of time, but didn't really give any benefit either. Okay folks, we have got the camo down, but now we need to help recreate a bit of shape and depth to the camoed area. Camo is supposed to break up the shape, but we as painters don't want the shape broken up, otherwise it just becomes a little blob. Normally, as I said before, I layer up from a shade colour, leaving the shade in that I want to define the shape. In this case I've got to go back and cut it in. So I'm using my shade colour, the German Camo Black Brown, and I am carefully painting along seams, joins between the different fabrics, whether they are sewn together or just laid together. Cutting it in very thin lines here folks. You've got to be careful. If it's too strong a line it will just look unnatural, and also the thin line will go into the background, a thick line will stand out into the foreground, which a shade shouldn't do. A shade should be a background colour. I'm also going to paint into the folds of the sculpt. Not too many of these because it's a very busy surface, just enough to create the lines that you would expect to see in a folded cloth that's hanging down off a figure, or the lines you might expect to see in the folds of an elbow or off around the neck, and all these areas, just to give it a little bit more shape and depth. But this is the area where you can really get it wrong if that line is too bold. It's got to be a really thin line, and to get that your paint has got to be mixed just right so that it flows off the brush, creating an opaque line, but it doesn't drag off the brush because it's too dry, or it doesn't flow loosely off the brush because it's too wet. Takes a little bit of practice, but it can be done with that practice. And once that's done, you're going to have a very nice camo backdrop, very nice camo colours, nice camo shapes, and you've also got depth and definition to it. So that, especially on this figure, is really the core of the finished look. That's the hard work done for the figure, but there's still a lot of painting to be done because German figures carry a hell of a lot of junk onto the tabletop folks. So we'll start with the field grey. Many different colours can be used for this. I'm currently using Panzerace's dark mud as my main colour with a highlight of green grey. And I've mentioned layering before. Here I'm starting that process. I am using my dark mud and kind of painting like lines to begin with, over the sculpt of the figure, all of the raised areas, leaving German Camo Black Brown and the recessed areas as shade. And I'm going to do it in two passes. The first pass is going to map out the finished look. The second pass is going to give it another coat of paint, but also define that finished look by controlling the amount of shade that is visible. I don't want too much shade showing. If it's too much, it's going to dominate the finished result and it's going to look unnatural and not quite so green. The best thing to remember when it comes to the shading and also the highlight is these are accents, small accents to the main layer of colour. And here I'm painting the highlight using the green grey, and I am painting very thin lines, painting them as much as possible adjacent to the shade colour. The reason for that is that you'll get the highest contrast between light and shade and therefore the greatest depth and visible shape. I'm not, in most cases, painting that line on the highest point of a fold, for instance, like dry brushing would pick out. It's more about the contrast between shade colour and highlight colour. And remember to follow the map that we've already left in the figure there with all the shade. Follow that, don't go over the top and paint lots of highlight lines all over the figure because it'll start to look really stripy if you do that. To save this video from going too long and to keep the focus on the camo, I am not going to go into a great deal of detail on how to paint all the baggage that these figures carry. You know, the bread bag, the water bottle, gas mask canister, entrenching tool and so on. But if you go to the description, you will see a link to an early war German infantry demo that will cover this in all the detail that you're going to need. So I hope you found this interesting and it gave you some ideas about Zelt bands and Splinter Camo. I probably will return to this subject in the future and maybe try to do something with washes on the Zelt band, but try to keep that bright finish. And to see more bolt action tutorials, go to the playlist section of the channel and there is one dedicated to that subject there. And if you subscribe and hit the bell button, that means you'll be able to catch up on the many bolt action tutorials that I have planned. So thanks for watching, folks. Hopefully we'll see you all on the next one.